So today I'm going to give a very brief overview on how karma, one of the fundamental doctrines of Buddhism and other Indian religious systems, evolved over time. So first, karma means action, and in the context of Buddhism, it refers to ethical action that conditions the nature of the next rebirth a person takes. What's striking is that this notion of karma is absent from the earliest Vedic and Brahmanic writings. In the earliest strata, the Rig Veda, karma is not ethical action but ritual action and often is connected to sacrifice. As for reincarnation, it's not present either. Rather, souls of the departed ride on wings to the land of the fathers where they will enjoy eternal rest. So how did the doctrine of karma emerge? The best answer, I think, is found in Dr. Gananath Obeyesekere's monumental work, Karma and Rebirth, a cross-cultural study. He proposes karma evolved as a reflection of the rebirth cycle and integrated what he calls ethicization, a key concept emerging from the axial age circa 500 to 300 BC. So first, if an ethical version of karma was the product of reflecting on the rebirth cycle, and rebirth is absent in the earliest strata of Vedic thought, where did belief in rebirth come from? The first important part of this answer is that belief in rebirth is not a unique doctrine of India. In fact, it's virtually ubiquitous, found all over the world, and likely forms a very archaic doctrine of humanity. Dr. Obeyesekere proposes that although rebirth is absent in the early Vedic literature, it is possible that rebirth narratives existed among peoples of the region and time, despite not being recorded. So he analyzes the beliefs of several what he calls small-scale societies. This is in opposition to the pejorative term primitive tribes. And he does this to establish an elementary model of rebirth that underlied the beliefs of those societies and may have been present in India. So the characteristic elements found all over the world are that the rebirth cycle is automatic. It appears to be a fact of nature that simply is and is not fueled by any source. Second, the person reborn is one's ancestor within a kin group, and this makes sense since we are dealing with small-scale societies that have to limit the number of souls being reborn. Third, there is an afterlife which is either a mirror reflection of this world or an idealized version of it, and that this world is a temporary waiting place until the soul returns to another body. Fourth, and perhaps most striking of all, is that one's actions have no impact on the conditions of one's rebirth or afterlife. In other words, there is no sin that puts you in hell or reincarnates you into a lesser life form. Now, this is not to say, though, that people living in small-scale societies have no morals or ethics. They do, but their actions play no part in their post-mortem state. If a person commits adultery or steals and are found guilty, they are punished on earth by the society, but not punished in a future life. Whereas in Buddhism or Christianity, such actions do carry into the hereafter or next rebirth. The afterlife and rebirth from a small-scale society perspective is therefore available to all. If there is any requirement, it is that one needs to have proper funeral rites in order to move on to the next afterlife. Now, the earliest narratives of rebirth that also contain a shift in karma towards ethical action are found in the early Upanishads, and in particular the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, a pre-Buddhist text dated to the 6th to 7th century BC. In it, we find a narrative of the great sage Yajnavalkya conversing with King Janaka on what happens to unliberated souls after death. He says, quote, "It is like this. Just as a weaver, after she has removed the colored yarn, weaves a different design that is newer and more attractive, so the self, after it has knocked down this body and rendered it unconscious, makes for himself a different figure that is newer and more attractive, the figure of a forefather, or of a Gandharva, or of a god, or of Prajapati, or of Brahman, or else the figure of some other being." Unquote. Now here it is clear that the self, or Atman, can be reborn into various beings, and highlights the possibility of good rebirths. What the sage adds is that one's rebirth condition is based on good and bad karma. Quote, "What a man turns out to be depends on how he acts and how he conducts himself. If his actions are good, he will turn into something good. If his actions are bad, he will turn into something bad." Unquote. So for the sage Yajnavalkya, karma drives rebirth, although here it is conditioned by desire. Those without desire arrive at the ultimate reality, Brahman, and those with desire continue to be reborn into different forms. Now, what's really curious about this passage is that Yajnavalkya, like the later great luminary Buddha, are members of the Kshatriya class rather than the Brahmin. The Kshatriya were the military aristocracy, and one would have thought such knowledge would have been found among the priests rather than the warriors. Dr. Obeyesekere suggests that such passages may contain a cultural memory of the Kshatriya possessing a knowledge that the Brahmin lacked or lost, and therefore it can be concluded that the rebirth narrative of the Upanishads came from a source outside of the Vedas, but was in India and perhaps even one that remained with the Kshatriya. This rebirth narrative was then creatively incorporated into the Upanishadic tradition. The Kshatriya, or rather the Kshatriya sages of these Upanishadic texts, therefore represent the dramatized personification of popular beliefs of rebirth known in the region. So if we can accept the possibility that rebirth existed in the background of the Vedic period and was then incorporated later, we may now ask how karma itself further developed. The key here for Dr. Obeyesekere is found in the Axial Age, the period roughly from 500 to 300 BC that gave rise to thinkers like Confucius and Laozi of China, Elijah and Isaiah of the Middle East, Pythagoras and Plato of Greece, and of course the Buddha in India. This period was of intense and almost simultaneous intellectual activity across the world, with a characteristic focus on soteriology and reframing of ethical acts through a cosmic perspective. This period gave rise to what Dr. Obeyesekere calls ethicization, which represents the process of transforming morally right and wrong acts into religiously right and wrong acts that do affect the individual's destiny after they die. With this in place, Dr. Obeyesekere argues the logical conclusion of this ethicization process is an ethical theory of karma. Action now carries positive and negative consequences after death. Rather than being limited to societal reward and punishment of small-scale societies, there is now punya karma, or sin, and papa karma, or merit that affects the nature of the next rebirth. So whereas in small-scale societies entry into the other world was a privilege of all, that if anything depended on proper funeral rites, now entry is conditional, depending on an individual's worldly actions. The afterworld, therefore, is transformed into a world of reward and punishment. There is no longer a single place for the good and bad. There must be at minimum two places, a world of reward, heaven, and a world of retribution, or hell. We see this step in Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam, though the latter two stop here and manifest what Dr. Obeyesekere calls occasional ethicization, an ethicization that has not been taken to its full logical conclusion. Just as the other world necessarily had to be split between good and bad, there now must be a good and bad rebirth. Systemic ethicization continues to affect the next rebirth by conditioning it to the preceding birth's karma. At this stage, a rebirth into one's kin group, which was expected in a small-scale society, is now no longer expected in systemic ethicization. There is a dislocation as the individual's rebirth is no longer confined within kin or gender. Consequently, the individual reborn is no longer the same person they were in a previous existence. All this generates a perception of the rebirth cycle that is not a thing in itself, but something that is the product of one's own actions. In other words, it looks as if rebirth is generated from ethics itself. And here we land to a fully developed karmic theory as understood in Buddhism, an impersonal and law-like theory that no intercessory god can break, and whom the gods themselves are subjected to. Still, there was diversity in how this ethical karma was interpreted and even accepted. Buddhism took karma specifically as intentional action that carries consequences in the rebirth cycle, whereas Jainism went further to say unintentional actions also drive the cycle. Still others represented a conservatism that resisted karmic theory entirely. This counter-theory is known as Akiriyam Vyakasa, the belief there are no karmic consequences. Purana Kassapa was one of the many teachers during the Buddha's time who argued against ethicization of karmic action. He subscribed to the more ancient view that the good or bad one does has nothing to do with their fate in the afterlife. This represents a defense of unethicized rebirth. These like-minded teachers form the group known as the Ajivikas. Mokkala Gosala, another Ajivika teacher, proposed that every individual goes through 1.4 million rebirths, and then the cycle comes to an end, so eventually everyone will achieve salvation. The force that drives the rebirth cycle in this scenario is not karma, but rather niyati, or fate, which has a similar impersonal and law-like quality to karma. Associated with niyati is bhava, or nature, and sangati, chance. As it is said here, quote, "Some believe that the universe was produced by svabhava and that everything comes about by svabhava only." Gunaratana said, quote, "What makes the sharpness of thorns and the varied nature of beasts and birds? All this comes about by svabhava. There is nothing which acts at will." Unquote. So almost like an atheistic principle to the universe. So with this we see, as in many religious systems, there was an oscillating movement between innovative thought and conservative resistance, ultimately forming the living and evolutionary nature of religious ideas. So I hope this brief video has given you a deeper and greater appreciation of karmic theory. Thank you and take care.